The presup argument led me to God. This is a sentence I have never heard anyone utter. If anyone out there was led to God or Christianity or Islam because of the presup argument, please let me know. I would love to talk to you. What is the presup argument? Take a listen.
Tools needed for intelligibility are only possible if God exists. And since those tools do exist, we know that God exists. Everybody knows that God exists.
So you don't know what's real, and truth is that what's real, therefore you can't know what is true, and therefore you're not in this discussion.
Okay. And how do you know what's real? And how do you know that your senses are valid?
And
well, when you make that determination, are you using your senses? Are you using your reasoning when you come to that conclusion? Okay, so you're using your senses and memory and reasoning in order to justify your senses and memory and reasoning properly. And I'm asking you, how do you know that it's functioning properly? And do you use your reasoning in that process? Are you using your reasoning? You know that your cognitive faculties could be not working properly. I'm saying that the reason that you can know things is because God exists. How do you know your reasoning about that is valid? How do you know that the impossible is impossible? Paul, is that true? Paul, is that true? Is that true? What is truth according to your worldview? Must my answer be true?
God is universal. He's not made of matter. He does not change. Logic is universal. It's not made of matter. It does not change. Logic reflects the thinking of God. That's how I justify the laws of logic. And I'm asking atheists how they justify them without God.
My worldview is that which comports to the mind of God, and you do not use that definition. Well, you already know that God exists. Paul, is it true that it's an assertion? Yes, by a viciously circular argument. Is that true? Is that true, Paul? It's not exactly fun for everybody to just hear the same thing over and over again. Now, would you say that atheism is a valid form of reasoning, Paul? But you don't want to answer my question, starting with the Christian God, and I'm saying that you can't get to reasoning unless you start there. You assume the validity of your reasoning in order to justify it. Do you use your cognitive faculties when you determine that they are valid? How do you know that you're in the right reality? How do you know that the reality that you're experiencing is the real one? How do you know that?
I believe that I can understand.
Valid. Or how do you know that your reasoning about that is valid? How do you know that your reasoning about mathematics is valid? You could be a dream. Well, if you can't prove to me that reality is real, then what reality? Because you said that reality, we could be the thoughts of a dragon.
Reality.
So you could be wrong. So you don't know what's real, and truth is that what's real, therefore you can't know what is true, and therefore you're not in this discussion. So you could be wrong. So you don't know what's real, and truth is that what's real, therefore you can't know what is true, and therefore you're not in this discussion. So you could be wrong.
What is the presuppositional argument, or presup for short? It is basically an argument that presupposes, presumes that God exists. Usually the presuppositionalist would say that they know through divine revelation, a revelation that they can know God exists with certainty. Here I've posted some typical evidential arguments for God and logical arguments for God, but I'm going to let Side 10 Bruggencate tell you why all these arguments for God fail.
So do we defend a probable God or a certain God in the world? Well, let's look at some common arguments for the existence of God. I'll go through them quickly. I'm not very well schooled. I used to really know these arguments really well because that's what my website was built on. When I was starting this website, proving the existence of God, I was learning all of these arguments, and I learned them well. And I talked to Christians about them, and they said, wow, that's fantastic. You got to get out there. You got to use these arguments. And I would go online, I'd use these arguments, and I'd get them thrown back in my face. And it was so frustrating. Now, it never affected my faith because, I love the Lord. I love the Lord, and I use these arguments, and people, they just stonewall me. They would throw the arguments back.
They would throw these arguments back to his face. I'm assuming he's talking about unbelievers or atheists. He would talk about all these arguments, the evidential arguments and the logical arguments, and he admits here that they were thrown back in his face, and yet he says, but it didn't affect his belief. It didn't affect his faith because he loved God. And I did a video on beliefs come first, reasons come second, and here's a prime example of that a lot of people just believe because they believe, and the reasons are secondary, and he's basically is admitting to that here.
And I didn't know why. Well, I'm going to tell you why. Those arguments are bad arguments. Another argument, teleological argument, and the argument for the resurrection. Those are three typical arguments. We'll just go through those quickly. Now, if you people are experts in these arguments, you might want to correct me on some of this, and because I don't use them anymore, I'm probably not as kind to those arguments that maybe I should be, and we could talk about their real faults, but let's go through them quickly here. Arguments for the existence of God. The cosmological argument basically says everything which begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, so it must have a cause. That cause must itself be an uncaused cause or a God. Therefore, God exists. Does that sound familiar? I used to love that argument. Everything which begins to exist has a cause. We know the universe began to exist. It must have a cause. That cause must be an uncaused cause. That cause is God. Cosmological argument, in a nutshell. Problems with the cosmological argument. How do you know that everything which begins to exist has a cause? Have you observed this? How do you know that everything began to exist?
Preach it, Si, preach it.
Why do all these things have to have one cause and not multiple causes? Everything which we observe to begin to exist has a natural cause. Why must the ultimate cause be a supernatural God? Why does that God not need a cause? If that God doesn't need a cause, why does the universe need a cause? Even if that cause is a God, which God is it? This used to be my favorite argument. It's garbage.
So basically what Si is saying here is that these arguments are not working with non-believers. And so this is the genesis. The presuppositional argument has been around for a long, long time, and it comes and goes in waves. But with the advancement of science and technology, it's seemingly coming back with a vengeance, because Christians are being challenged on the ontological arguments, the teleological arguments, the cosmological arguments, and it's causing them to doubt. And so the presuppositional argument is basically saying, hey, you can't know anything without God. You can't have a standard, a basis of morality or logic or existence or anything without this God. So when I talk to theists and I ask them why do they believe what they believe, why are they a Christian, or specifically why, if they are a Christian, why they believe the Bible is God's word, they'll say, well, there's tons of archaeological evidence. And so then I'll just ask the question, well, isn't it possible some things in the Bible are true and some things are not? Isn't that a reasonable question? So just because there's archaeological evidence for, let's say, a city mentioned in the Bible, does that mean the whole Bible is true? So Christians struggle with that. Well, yeah, they would have to admit, yeah, you could be right, Doug. Textual evidence. I've hear from many people, well, there's eyewitness accounts. Are eyewitness accounts always trustworthy? Well, of course not. But we have good reason to believe that these eyewitness accounts are trustworthy. Well, how would we determine whether these eyewitness accounts are truly trustworthy or not? And maybe there was no eyewitnesses at all. Maybe it just says that there was eyewitnesses in the textual evidence. Prophecy, again, prophecy is in the eye of the beholder. If there's another holy text that has prophecies, it's very easy for someone outside that belief system to critique it and say, oh no, this can be explained this, and this way. But believers in the Bible, they cannot use those same methods of critiquing to their own prophecies. Uniqueness doesn't make something true. Every religion has something unique about itself, and Christians would not say that other belief systems are true based on their uniqueness, so why do they say it on their own? Consistency, something can be consistent and still false. You can have a novel that's perfectly consistent, no logical contradictions, and yet still false. Another reason, and this is probably the most powerful reason that people believe, is the experiential reason, a transformed life. I hear that many, many times again. But again, this should cause the Christian to doubt, because, and I'm picking on Christians here, but the same holds true for other religions. You can have a transformed life. You can change dramatically for naturalistic reasons. And other religions, you see people completely change, and yet Christians would say, well, yeah, their lives changed, but it wasn't because of their God. Maybe your life changed not because of a God. And so Sai already talked about the logical arguments for God, the ontological, the cosmological, the teleological. Basically, every argument you can pick holes in very easily. And Sai's admitting this. So he's basically saying, since these are not good reasons or arguments for God, we have to basically follow Scripture, he believes, just to say that we believe it, we're Christians because God said so. Another argument is Pascal's wager. Well, if I'm wrong, then I haven't lost anything, but if you're wrong, Doug, you're going to hell. Horrible argument, because if a Muslim is correct, then both the Christian and me are going to hell. And a lot of people who use the presuppositional apologetic do so because to use evidence, to use logical arguments, is to say that you're putting God on trial. And who are you as a mere mortal to put the supreme being on trial for you to judge whether the evidence is good enough or the arguments are good enough? So the presuppositional argument is basically saying, no, you should not do that. In fact, it's a sin to do so. So the presuppositional argument kind of puts the atheist or the non-believer on defensive by taking advantage of the seeming weakness in uncertainty. If you can't be certain about something, then how can you say you know it? But in my experience, I've talked to a lot of presups in the past year. The way I deal with them is I readily admit my own presuppositions. I presuppose the universe exists and that the universe has the properties and the nature it has, just like they presuppose a God which has the nature it has. So when I reveal my presuppositions and say I presuppose the universe and then build up based on those presuppositions of the nature of the universe, I can then say I know things. In order to engage with the precept effectively, you have to keep a couple definitions very clear in your mind. One is the concept of truth, and the other is the concept of knowledge. Truth is that which is in accordance with reality. But I heard a philosopher named John Shook add to it by saying this: however, truth is not a singular concept. The truths are all those things learned by reliable methods that have shown to be practically advantageous so far. Advantageous in the sense of being able to make predictions. If something can be predicted in a reliable way, we can say pragmatically our prediction is based on something true. The second definition that you should have clear in your mind is, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? Knowledge is a subset of belief existing in degrees of probability. What determines the probability of a belief being true is the reliability of the method and the evidence available for it. Now let's look at some common precept questions and how I would typically answer. Could you be wrong about everything you know? I usually answer no. I know that I'm not your God. I know that I'm not omniscient. And I know that I'm thinking right now. The second most commonly asked question is that true? Or could you be wrong about that? To answer that question, and they ask that question a lot, I would always go back to the definition of truth. Truth is that which is in accordance with reality. However, truth is not a singular concept. The truths are all those things learned by reliable methods that have shown to be practically advantageous so far. Advantageous in the sense of being able to make predictions. If something can be predicted in a reliable way, we can say pragmatically our prediction is based on something true. So whenever they ask, is that true? If you repeat that definition of truth, I have a feeling they're going to stop asking you, is that true? The third most commonly asked question is in regards to reasoning. How do you justify it? This is how I answer. I start with my properly basic beliefs, my presupposition. Based on my properly basic belief and the success of predictive models that can be falsified, I can justify that my reasoning is valid. I justify my reasoning by their continued reliability of producing effective results. Greg Bahnsen, which is a quite famous presuppositional apologist, has said, we must reason by presupposition. He said this in his book, Presuppositional Procedure. So if Greg Bahnsen can do it, if the precept can do it, if they can reason based on presupposition, so can the non-believer. Are some people's reasoning invalid? Yes, on a particular situation, we could say that our reasoning is invalid, and it may be valid in other situations. If your reasoning could be invalid, how do you know you're not that person with invalid reasoning? In order to answer the question if my reasoning is invalid, I would go back to the definition of knowledge. In order for me to have knowledge, I first have to have a belief, and then that belief has to correspond to reality in the sense of having a high probability of making accurate predictions. If I can use my reasoning in such a way that it leads to predictions with a high probability of success, I can say my reasoning is valid. Isn't it circular and thus logically invalid to use your reasoning to justify your reasoning? I would answer yes, it is a logical fallacy to use reasoning to justify reasoning. What I would say is, I start with my properly basic belief, and I reason based on my presupposition. And as Greg Bonson said, we must reason by presupposition. So therefore, I'm not using circular reasoning. What is your ultimate authority? Now, this question isn't asked too often, but often enough that I put it up here. I would say that, and again, I'm going to quote Greg Bonson, who is a presuppositional apologist. Greg Bonson said, "Presuppositions have the greatest authority in one's thinking. When it gets around to verifying the ultimate authority against another person's ultimate authority, I will end up eventually assuming my ultimate authority, but so will the unbeliever." So in other words, my ultimate authority is my presupposition. How do you account for the laws of logic? This is one that Cy 10 Bruggencate often asks. To answer this question, I think it's good to picture how they would answer the question, and you answer it the exact same way, changing a few words. So Cy 10 Bruggencate often asks, how do you justify or account for the laws of logic? And he answers it this way. The laws of logic reflect the thinking of God. God is universal. He's not made of matter. He does not change. Logic is universal, not made of matter, and does not change. Logic reflects the thinking of God, and that's how I justify the laws of logic. And I am asking atheists how they justify the laws of logic without God. So I'm going to answer the question the same way he does on how I justify or account for the laws of logic. The laws of logic reflect the properties of the universe. The universe is universal by definition. The universe is made of matter, and then the constants of the universe do not change. Logic is universal. Logic is a property of matter, and logic does not change. Logic reflects a property of the universe, and that's how I justify the laws of logic. And I am asking theists how they would justify the laws of logic without borrowing from my worldview. The reason why the Presup apologists ask those 5 questions is because they think that you cannot answer those questions without believing in a God. But I think I've shown that you can answer those questions just by changing the presupposition. Instead of using a deity as a presupposition, you can use the universe and the properties and the nature of the universe as your presupposition. This apologetic, I don't believe, leads anyone to God. It is a way to make the believer feel good about what they believe and that they do have good reasons to believe it. But when in doubt, when they ask you a question, think about how they would answer it. And then you answer it the same way with your presupposition. And I do think most people have the presupposition that we don't live in the matrix, that the universe does exist and the universe does have the nature and the properties that it does have. And from that, we can learn things and we can gain knowledge and we can use that knowledge to make predictions and better our lives through science and technology. One question that the Presup apologist might ask you is, well, Doug, couldn't your presupposition be wrong? And I hope they ask me that question. Because if they do ask me that question, that I could have chosen the wrong presupposition, then I can turn around and ask them that same question back. Is your presupposition that God exists and that God is real? Could that be wrong? And they don't want to answer that one. They'll have to say, no, it's a presupposition and it's right, it's true. And so I could say the same thing. The universe exists, it's real, that's right, it's true. One criticism I get about my worldview is that it eventually leads to absurdity, that I cannot account or justify for certain things. But I think the theist takes their presupposition, one presupposition too far. And sure, atheists don't agree and have different views on many different things, but when it comes to God, atheists are either agnostic or Gnostic, I guess, but they just don't believe in a God. If you think about the concept of God, most people have a very complex definition of God, especially when you get into the nature of this God. What is this God like? And as an example of this, here's a friend of mine who I summarized his beliefs about that reflect the nature of his God and what he believes about his God. And so this friend, let's call him Jake. When it comes to the concept of God, Jake is a presuppositional, classical cessational, postmillennial, partial preterial, covenantal, non-theonomist, Presbyterian, evangelical, Reformed Calvinist, Protestant Christian, holding to a regulative principle of worship while prescribing to the theory of common grace. Now for me, when it comes to the concept of God, I'm an agnostic atheist. Now which worldview sounds more absurd?
So you could be wrong. So you don't know what's real, and truth is that was real, therefore you can't know what is true, and therefore you're not in this discussion. So you could be wrong. So you don't know what's real, and truth is that was real, therefore you can't know what is true, and therefore you're not in this discussion. So you could be wrong.